Tommy Baker was running, not away from anything but toward it. His wife, Margaret, worked the morning shift at the chemical plant right next to the docks, and the ground had just shaken so hard it cracked the plaster off his kitchen wall. He could see the sky from his front porch, and it did not look right. A black column of smoke was climbing straight up into the morning air, and at its base, a dark orange glow was spreading across the waterfront like nothing he had ever seen before. He grabbed his truck keys off the counter and ran out the door without closing it behind him. He did not know it yet, but Margaret was already gone. She had been standing at her station inside the plant when the cargo ship at the dock next door, loaded with over 2,000 tons of ammonium nitrate, detonated at exactly 12 minutes past 9 on the morning of April 16, 1947. The explosion obliterated the ship entirely. It produced a blast so powerful that it launched a 2-ton steel anchor nearly 2 miles through the air and buried it in a 10-foot crater on the other side of town. It generated a mushroom cloud that rose over 2,000 feet into the sky. It sent a 15-foot wall of water surging across the docks, sweeping workers and bystanders off their feet and dragging the dead and the dying back into the harbor as it receded. It knocked 2 small airplanes out of the sky that had been passing overhead. It shattered windows in the city of Galveston, 10 miles across the bay, and it killed every single firefighter who had responded to the scene. All 27 members of the Texas City Volunteer Fire Department had driven their 4 trucks down to the pier that morning because smoke had been pouring from the ship for over an hour. They set up their hoses. They climbed aboard the vessel. They were standing right on top of it when it went off. Not a single one of them survived. Most of their bodies were never found. But Tommy did not know any of that yet. All he knew was that the sky had turned black and the chemical plant where his wife worked was somewhere inside that wall of smoke. So he drove toward it. He was not the only one. Hundreds of people across Texas City were doing the same thing, running toward the waterfront to find their husbands, their wives, their fathers, their sons. They had no idea that a second ship, docked right next to the first one, was loaded with another 1,000 tons of the same chemical that had just torn their city apart, along with nearly 2,000 tons of sulfur, and that ship was already on fire. This is the deadliest industrial disaster in American history. It killed nearly 600 people. It injured more than 5,000. It destroyed over 1,000 buildings and left more than 800 children without a parent. It wiped out an entire fire department in a single morning and left the city with no way to fight the fires that would burn for days afterward. And almost nobody talks about it. The reason this story has been buried for nearly 80 years is not because it was a freak accident. It is not because there was no one to blame. It is because the people responsible for what happened in Texas City were the same people who got to decide whether anyone would be held accountable. The United States government knew exactly what was on those ships. They had manufactured the chemical themselves. They had set the rules for how it was packaged and loaded. And when nearly 600 people died because of decisions made in government offices, thousands of miles from the docks of Texas City, the government fought for years to make sure no one ever had to answer for it. Before we go deeper into this story, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you, and do not forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. This is the story of how a small town in Texas became the site of the worst industrial catastrophe this country has ever seen. How the same chemical that won a world war was repackaged, reclassified, and shipped through a civilian port with no warnings, no precautions, and no plan for what would happen if something went wrong. And how, when everything did go wrong, the families left behind had to fight the very government that caused it just to be told that their suffering was not the government's problem. To understand what happened in Texas City, you have to understand 3 things that almost nobody puts together when they first hear this story. The first is what was actually on those ships and why. Because the cargo was not some exotic industrial chemical or classified military material. It was fertilizer. Bags of fertilizer stacked floor to ceiling in the cargo holds, tens of thousands of them, each one weighing 100 pounds and wrapped in paper coated with paraffin wax. The workers who loaded those bags onto the ship had no idea they were handling a potential explosive. The longshoremen had been told it was fertilizer and nothing more. There were no hazard warnings, no special handling instructions, no safety protocols. And yet, during the war, the United States Army had classified the exact same compound, ammonium nitrate, as a high explosive. The Army had used it to build bombs. They knew what it could do, and then when the war ended, they simply reclassified it and started shipping it through civilian ports as if it were no more dangerous than a bag of grain. The second thing you need to understand is what happened in the hour before the explosion, because it was not sudden. It was not a surprise. Smoke had been rising from that ship since 8 o'clock in the morning. The fire department had been called. The crew had been alerted. People could see the smoke from across town. And instead of evacuating, instead of clearing the docks, instead of treating that ship like the floating bomb it actually was, hundreds of people walked toward it. They gathered at the end of the pier to watch. School children skipped class to see the colorful smoke. Workers left the refineries to get a better look. Nobody was afraid because nobody had been told there was anything to be afraid of. And the third thing, the thing that makes this story different from every other industrial disaster you have ever heard of, is what happened after. Because the families of Texas City did not quietly accept what had happened to them. They filed the first class action lawsuit ever brought against the United States government. They took their case all the way to the Supreme Court. And what the government did in response tells you everything you need to know about why this story has been kept out of the history books for nearly 80 years. To understand what happened in Texas City, 47, you would have smelled it before you saw it. The air carried a permanent trace of petroleum and sulfur that hung over the town like a second sky. Refinery stacks lined the waterfront, burning off gas day and night, and the glow from their flares lit up the horizon after dark. Texas City sat on the western shore of Galveston Bay, about 35 miles southeast of Houston, and by 1947, it had become one of the most concentrated industrial corridors in the country. Within a single mile of the port, there were 6 major oil and chemical companies, 9 piers, 11 warehouses, a grain elevator, and hundreds of homes. The Monsanto Chemical Company operated a large styrene plant just a few hundred feet from the docks. Republic Oil, Humble Oil, Stone Oil, and several other refineries ran 24-hour shifts processing crude. The town had a population of roughly 16,000 people, and almost every one of them owed their living to the industry that surrounded them. Texas City had not always been this way. Before the war, it was a modest port town, busy but unremarkable. The war changed everything. The federal government designated the area as a critical zone for wartime chemical and petroleum production. New plants were built. Existing facilities were expanded. Workers poured in from across Texas and the surrounding states, drawn by refinery wages that were better than anything they could earn on a farm or in a small-town shop. Many of them were veterans who had just come home from Europe or the Pacific, men who had survived the war and were looking to build something stable for their families. They bought small houses in the neighborhoods that pressed right up against the industrial zone, sometimes less than half a mile from the docks and the chemical plants. It was close, but that was the point. You could walk to work. You could hear the shift whistle from your kitchen table. And the money was good. A man like Walter Grimes would have fit right into that picture. He was 34 years old, a veteran of the Army, and he had moved to Texas City in 1945 because the Monsanto plant was hiring. He worked the day shift in the styrene production unit, a job that required him to be on his feet for 8 hours in a building that sat directly across the ship channel from the main cargo pier. His wife, Ruth, stayed home with their 2 children, a boy of 6 and a girl of 3. They lived in a small wood frame house about 10 blocks from the waterfront, close enough that Ruth could hear the ship's horns when the wind blew from the south. Walter liked the work. It was steady, it paid well, and after 3 years in the Army, steady and well-paying were the only two things he was looking for. He did not think much about what was inside the ships that came and went from the docks every week. That was not his department. Then there was a man like Joe Fletcher, one of the 27 volunteers, who made up the Texas City Fire Department. Joe was 41, a pipe fitter at one of the refineries during the day, and a volunteer firefighter the rest of the time. He had been with the department for 6 years. The department was small but proud. They had 4 trucks and a station house, and a chief named Henry Baumgartner who had built the department from nothing. These were not full-time professional firefighters. They were refinery workers, mechanics, shopkeepers, and tradesmen who gave up their free time because Texas City needed a fire department, and nobody else was going to do it. When the alarm sounded, they dropped whatever they were doing and showed up. That was the deal. No exceptions. And then there were the longshoremen, the men who actually loaded and unloaded the ships. Dock work in Texas City was hard, physical labor. You showed up before dawn, you hauled cargo all day, and you went home sore. The men who did this work were not paid to ask questions about what was inside the bags and crates they moved. They were told what to load, where to put it, and how fast to do it. In the spring of 1947, the cargo moving through the port of Texas City included oil, cotton, grain, tobacco, peanuts, drilling equipment, and a growing volume of something that had started arriving by rail from government plants in Nebraska and Iowa. It came in 100-pound paper sacks, each one printed with the words, fertilizer-grade ammonium, nitrate. The sacks were warm to the touch when the workers picked them up, which some of them thought was odd, but nobody told them to be concerned about it. Nobody told them anything at all. That chemical, ammonium nitrate, had a history that the men on the docks knew nothing about. During the war, the United States Army had manufactured it in massive quantities at ordnance plants across the Midwest. It was a key ingredient in military explosives. The Army classified it as a Class A explosive and handled it under strict safety protocols. Armed guards, no smoking zones, fireproof containers, dedicated transport vehicles. But when the war ended in 1945, the government had a problem. The ordnance plants were still running, the stockpiles were growing, and there was no longer a military need for all of it. So the government made a decision. Instead of shutting down the plants, they would convert the production line. The same chemical that had been used to build bombs would be repackaged as agricultural fertilizer and shipped overseas to help rebuild the war-torn farmlands of Europe. It was a practical solution. Europe needed food. America had the chemical. The only thing that changed was the label. But the label was not the only thing that should have changed. When ammonium nitrate was handled as a military explosive, it was stored in fireproof containers, kept away from heat sources, and never loaded near flammable materials. When it was reclassified as fertilizer, those precautions were dropped. The compound was now packed in paper bags coated with paraffin wax, a flammable material, and loaded onto ships alongside cotton, twine, tobacco, and in some cases, small arms ammunition. There were no hazard warnings on the bags. There were no special loading instructions. The Coast Guard, which was responsible for overseeing the safety of cargo in American ports, had regulations on the books for handling dangerous materials, but those regulations were not being enforced. In fact, the Coast Guard was not even aware that ammonium nitrate was being shipped through Texas City in such large quantities. The port of Houston, just 35 miles up the coast, had refused to allow ammonium nitrate to be loaded at its docks because the Port Authority there considered it too dangerous. Texas City had no such restriction, and so by the spring of 1947, over 80,000 tons of the chemical had been shipped through Texas City without a single incident, without a single warning, and without a single person on those docks being told that the bags they were carrying had once been classified as high explosives by the United States Army. The morning of April 16, 1947, dawned clear and cool. With a brisk north wind and temperatures in the mid-50s, it was a Wednesday. The cargo ship that had been docked at Pier O since the 11th of April was called the Grand Camp. It was a French-registered Liberty ship, one of thousands built in American shipyards during the war and sold to foreign governments afterward. The Grand Camp had arrived in Texas City, carrying a mixed cargo of twine, peanuts, drilling equipment, tobacco, cotton, and 16 cases of small arms ammunition. It was there to pick up a load of ammonium nitrate fertilizer bound for France, where the chemical would be used to restore farmland that had been destroyed during the war. By the morning of April 16th, over 2,300 tons of ammonium nitrate had already been loaded into the ship's cargo holds. Another 600 tons were scheduled to be added that day. Just before 8 o'clock, the longshoremen removed the hatch covers on Hold 4 and climbed down into the cargo hold to begin the day's work. Within minutes, someone smelled smoke. A thin plume was rising from between the stacked bags of fertilizer and the hull of the ship, about 7 or 8 layers deep in the hold. The men tried to put it out with a jug of water and 2 small fire extinguishers, but the smoke kept coming. It was getting thicker and hotter, and the bags nearest to the source were starting to change color. The longshoremen were ordered out of the hold. This is where the first critical decision was made. The captain of the Grand Camp, a French officer, was notified of the fire. He had a choice to make. He could flood the hold with water, which would likely ruin the cargo, but might put out the fire, or he could seal the hold and pump steam into it, a technique commonly used on ships to smother fires by cutting off their oxygen supply. The captain chose the steam. He ordered the hatch covers back on, the ventilation sealed, and the steam lines opened. His priority was protecting the cargo. He did not want to damage the shipment. What he did not understand, and what nobody on that ship had been told, was that ammonium nitrate does not need oxygen to burn. It is an oxidizer. It produces its own oxygen as it decomposes. Pumping steam into a sealed hold full of decomposing ammonium nitrate did not smother the fire. It superheated it. It turned the cargo hold into a pressure cooker. By 8:30, the hatch covers blew off. A thick column of smoke erupted from the open hold, climbing into the morning sky in a color that witnesses would later describe as a pretty gold or a brilliant orange that was beautiful to see in the morning sunlight. The smoke was so unusual, so vivid, that it attracted attention from across the city. People stopped what they were doing and looked toward the waterfront. Workers in the refineries walked outside to get a better view. School children on their way to class paused to stare. And then slowly, people started walking toward the docks, not away from them, toward them. Hundreds of spectators gathered at the head of the ship channel, just a few hundred feet from the burning vessel, to watch the fire like it was a show. Nobody told them to leave. Nobody told them they were standing next to over 2,000 tons of a compound that the Army had once used to build bombs. They had no idea, and so they stood there and watched. The 27 men of the Texas City Volunteer Fire Department arrived with all 4 of their trucks. They set up hoses on the dock and began spraying water onto the deck of the Grand Camp. But the ship was so hot that the water turned to steam on contact. It was not making a difference. Chief Henry Baumgartner ordered his men to take the hoses aboard the ship and get closer to the source of the fire. The firefighters climbed up onto the deck of the Grand Camp. A photograph taken at approximately 8:45 that morning shows at least one stream of water playing on the deck. The firefighters silhouetted against the rising column of orange smoke. That photograph is one of the last images of the Texas City Fire Department. Every man visible in that picture was dead within 30 minutes. At 9 o'clock, flames erupted from the open hatch. The fire was no longer smoldering. It was burning openly, feeding on the ammonium nitrate and the paraffin-coated paper bags and the fuel oil that was stored in the bunker between Hold 3 and Hold 4. The heat was splitting the fuel tank, pouring oil onto the decomposing fertilizer, creating something that no one on that dock would have recognized. What was forming inside the hold of the Grand Camp was essentially a massive fuel and oxidizer mixture, the same basic combination used in commercial blasting operations. It was an improvised bomb the size of a building, and it was 12 minutes from detonation. At 12 minutes past 9, the Grand Camp exploded. The ship was completely obliterated. Over 6,000 tons of steel were launched into the air, some of it traveling at supersonic speed. The blast produced a shockwave that flattened nearly 1,000 buildings in Texas City and was felt 150 miles away in Louisiana. It registered on a seismograph in Denver, Colorado. A mushroom cloud rose more than 2,000 feet into the sky. A 15-foot tidal wave surged out of the ship channel, crashing across the docks and flooding the surrounding area. The wave swept a large steel barge completely out of the water and deposited it on shore in a residential neighborhood. One of the ship's anchors, a 2-ton piece of forged steel, was launched 1.5 miles through the air and landed in a 10-foot crater near the rail terminal. The other anchor, weighing 5 tons, was thrown 0.5 mile in the opposite direction. 2 small airplanes passing overhead were knocked out of the sky by the shockwave. 8 miles across the bay, people walking on the streets of Galveston were thrown to the ground, and every window facing the harbor was shattered. On the docks, the destruction was absolute. Every firefighter on the scene was killed instantly. The blast overpressure and heat disintegrated their bodies. The longshoremen, the spectators, the ship's crew, the people who had walked down to the waterfront to watch the colorful smoke. They were all gone. The Monsanto chemical plant, located directly across the ship channel just 300 feet away, took the full force of the explosion. Of the 574 workers on the morning shift, 145 were killed, and over 200 more were seriously injured. The plant was leveled, its walls collapsed inward, its machinery was thrown across the compound, and the chemicals stored inside ignited in a secondary explosion that sent a wall of flame rolling through the industrial zone. Falling debris from the Grand Camp rained down across Texas City for several minutes after the blast. Chunks of steel, some weighing several tons, crashed through rooftops and embedded themselves in streets and fields. Burning bales of twine and cotton from the ship's cargo fell out of the sky like flaming meteors, starting fires wherever they landed. The shrapnel ripped open oil storage tanks at the nearby refineries, and within minutes, massive petroleum fires were burning along the entire waterfront. Thick black smoke rose in columns that could be seen from 30 miles away. Walter Grimes had been standing at his station inside the Monsanto plant when the Grand Camp detonated. The blast wall hit the building like a freight train. The ceiling collapsed. The walls blew inward. Everything went dark. When he regained consciousness, he was lying under a pile of rubble with a broken arm and cuts across his face and chest. He could hear screaming around him, but he could not see anything through the dust and smoke. He dragged himself out of the wreckage and stumbled into the open air, and what he saw did not look like Texas City anymore. It looked like a battlefield. The entire waterfront was on fire. Buildings that had been standing minutes earlier were now piles of twisted metal and broken concrete. Bodies lay everywhere. People were staggering through the smoke with burns covering their arms and faces, calling out names, looking for anyone who could help them. The fire trucks were gone. The firefighters were gone. The water lines had been severed by the blast. There was no way to fight the fires. There was no way to call for help. The telephone lines were down. The power was out. Texas City, in the span of 12 minutes, had gone from a working industrial town to a disaster zone with no emergency services, no communications, and no idea that the worst was not yet over. Because docked in the adjoining slip, just a few hundred feet from where the Grand Camp had been, sat another ship, the High Flyer. It was a Liberty ship carrying 961 tons of ammonium nitrate and 1,800 tons of sulfur. The force of the Grand Camp's explosion had torn the High Flyer from its moorings and sent it drifting across the harbor, where it came to rest against a third vessel. The High Flyer's hatch covers had been blown off by the blast. and somewhere in its cargo hold, ammonium nitrate and sulfur were now exposed to open flame and searing heat. The combination of ammonium nitrate and sulfur is significantly more volatile than ammonium nitrate alone. The ship was badly damaged, but it had not yet detonated. For now, it was just sitting there, drifting and burning, while the rest of Texas City tried to figure out what had just happened. The crew of the high flyer stayed aboard for about an hour, trying to assess the damage before the smoke and sulfur fumes became too thick to breathe, and the captain ordered them to abandon ship. In the chaos of the afternoon, as rescue workers from surrounding towns began arriving in Texas City, and the scope of the disaster became clear, someone realized that the high flyer was also loaded with ammonium nitrate. The word went out. Another ship could blow. By late evening, the city's makeshift emergency command had arranged for tugboats to try to tow the high flyer out of the harbor and away from the remaining infrastructure. The tugboats arrived after dark. Crews went aboard and cut the anchor chain. The tugs attached tow lines and pulled, but the high flyer would not move. Debris from the first explosion, twisted steel and wreckage from the docks had wedged the ship in place. The tow lines strained and snapped. The crews tried again. The ship did not budge. By 1 o'clock in the morning on April 17th, flames were shooting out of the high flyer's cargo hold. The tugboat crews severed the tow lines and pulled away as fast as they could. 10 minutes later, at 1:10 in the morning, the high flyer exploded. Witnesses later said this blast felt even more powerful than the first. The detonation obliterated the high flyer and the ship it had been pushed against, destroyed the remaining dock infrastructure, and sent incandescent chunks of white-hot steel arcing high into the night sky like a grotesque fireworks display before they fell back to Earth across a wide radius, starting new fires in areas that had survived the first explosion. Crude oil storage tanks that had not yet been damaged burst into flames. A chain reaction of petroleum fires spread across the industrial district and burned for days. When the sun came up on April 17th, Texas City was unrecognizable. The waterfront was gone. The Monsanto plant was gone. Entire blocks of houses in the working-class neighborhoods nearest to the port had been flattened. Oil fires sent columns of black smoke into the sky that would not clear for a week. The entire volunteer fire department was dead. All 4 of their trucks had been destroyed in the first blast. And the people of Texas City, the ones who had survived, were left to search the rubble for their families with their bare hands. The first rescuers to arrive from outside Texas City came from Galveston, Houston, and the surrounding towns. They drove toward the smoke because they could see it from miles away. But when they reached the outskirts of the city, many of them stopped. They had expected a fire. What they found was closer to what American soldiers had seen in the bombed-out cities of Europe and the Pacific. Entire neighborhoods had been leveled. Steel rods from the ships had punched through houses like spears. Cars had been flipped and thrown into fields. The harbor was a churning mass of burning oil, wreckage, and bodies. One survivor would later say it was like something you had never seen or heard before. Within hours, the American Red Cross mobilized what would become its largest peacetime relief operation to that point. Military units were dispatched from nearby bases. Volunteers from as far away as Dallas and San Antonio drove through the night with medical supplies, blankets, and food. By the end of the first day, nearly 4,000 rescue workers were operating in Texas City, but the infrastructure they needed to do their work was gone. The roads nearest to the port were blocked by debris. The hospitals were overwhelmed. Many of the buildings that could have served as shelters or staging areas had been destroyed. Power and water were out across most of the city. The telephone system was down. Governor Buford Jester declared a disaster and issued a proclamation closing all roads into Texas City, except for those carrying rescue and relief personnel. The bodies came in faster than anyone could process them. The local morgue was full within hours. The high school gymnasium was converted into a temporary morgue, and a mechanic's garage nearby was turned into an embalming room. Over the following days, 150 embalmers worked around the clock in that garage, trying to prepare the dead for identification and burial. Dental students were brought in from local schools to help match dental records to remains, but many of the dead could not be identified at all. The blast had been so powerful that some victims were simply gone, vaporized or reduced to fragments that could not be matched to any known person. Of the confirmed dead, 405 were eventually identified. 63 bodies were never identified and were buried together in a memorial cemetery on the north side of town. Another 113 people were classified as missing because no trace of their remains was ever found. That number included most of the firefighters who had been standing on the deck of the Grand Camp when it detonated. The official death toll has never been definitively established. The most commonly cited figure is 581, but historians have long believed the true number is higher. There were visiting seamen in the port that day, whose names were never recorded. There were undocumented laborers working the docks whose families had no way to report them missing. There were travelers passing through the area who simply disappeared. Some estimates place the total number of dead closer to 600 or more. What is known with certainty is that more than 5,000 people were injured, over 1,700 of whom required hospitalization. More than 800 people were left widowed or orphaned. A residential area of 500 homes was leveled, and the total property damage, including the industrial facilities, the port infrastructure, and the 1.5 million barrels of petroleum that burned, exceeded $100 million in 1947 money, which would be well over $1 billion today. In the days and weeks that followed, the questions began. How had this happened? Who was responsible? And why had no one seen it coming? The investigation would reveal a chain of failures so long and so interconnected that it was almost impossible to point to a single cause. The fire on the Grand Camp had most likely been started by a discarded cigarette in the cargo hold. Smoking was officially banned on the docks, but the rule was routinely ignored. A cigarette had actually caused a small fire on the docks just 2 days before the disaster, and nothing had been done about it. The captain's decision to seal the hold and pump steam instead of flooding it with water was a catastrophic miscalculation, but he had no way of knowing that. Nobody had told him that ammonium nitrate was an oxidizer that did not need external oxygen to burn. The longshoremen had reported that the bags of fertilizer were warm to the touch before they were loaded, which suggested the chemical was already unstable. But nobody had flagged that as a concern, because nobody on the docks had been trained to recognize the signs of ammonium nitrate decomposition. But those were the immediate causes, the final links in a chain that stretched all the way back to Washington. The deeper question was why 2,300 tons of a compound that the Army had classified as a high explosive was sitting in the cargo hold of a ship docked in a civilian port, surrounded by oil refineries and chemical plants and residential neighborhoods, with no hazard warnings, no safety protocols, and no oversight. And the answer to that question led directly to the United States government. The ammonium nitrate had been manufactured at government ordnance plants, primarily the Cornhusker Ordnance Plant in Nebraska. The production process, the packaging specifications, the shipping arrangements, all of it had been done under government contracts and government direction. The government had decided to coat the bags in paraffin wax, a flammable material, to prevent moisture damage during the ocean crossing. The government had decided that the fertilizer did not need to be labeled as hazardous. The government had decided that the safety protocols used during wartime, the fireproof containers, the armed guards, the dedicated transport, were no longer necessary now that the chemical was being called fertilizer instead of explosive. The Coast Guard, which was supposed to oversee the loading of dangerous cargo at American ports, had failed to enforce its own regulations. Investigators found that Coast Guard inspectors had not been conducting safety checks on ammonium nitrate shipments at Texas City. The agency later claimed it was not even aware of the volume of ammonium nitrate moving through the port. This was difficult for many people to accept, given that over 80,000 tons had been shipped through Texas City in the 2 years before the disaster. The port of Houston, which was closer to the manufacturing centers and would have been a more logical shipping point, had banned ammonium nitrate loading because its port authority considered the chemical too dangerous. Texas City had no such ban, and the government had not required one. The families of Texas City did something that had never been done before in the history of the United States. They sued the federal government in 1948 under the Federal Tort Claims Act, a law that had been passed just 2 years earlier in 1946. 8,485 plaintiffs filed a class action lawsuit against the United States of America. It was the first class action of its kind. The case was called Dalehite versus the United States, named after Elizabeth Dalehite, whose husband Henry had been killed in the explosions. The plaintiffs argued that the government was responsible for the disaster because it had manufactured the ammonium nitrate, set the packaging and handling standards, controlled the shipping contracts, and failed to warn anyone of the chemical's explosive potential. The total damages sought were $200 million. The case went to trial in the Federal District Court in the Southern District of Texas. The trial was long and detailed, and the evidence presented by the plaintiffs was devastating. The district judge heard testimony about the government's decision to reclassify ammonium nitrate from an explosive to a fertilizer without changing the safety protocols. He heard about the Coast Guard's failure to enforce its own regulations. He heard about the paraffin-coated bags, the warm temperatures during loading, the complete absence of hazard labeling. He heard from survivors who described the morning of April 16th in detail that would haunt the courtroom. And when the trial was over, the judge ruled in favor of the plaintiffs. He found the government negligent on multiple counts in adopting the fertilizer export program, in controlling the manufacturing and packaging process, in failing to give notice of the chemical's dangerous nature to the people handling it, and in failing to police its loading onto ships. It was a landmark ruling. For the first time, a federal court had held the United States government liable for negligence that resulted in mass civilian casualties. But the government did not accept the ruling. The United States appealed the decision to the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, and the appeals court reversed the district judge's ruling. The court's reasoning centered on what is known as the discretionary function exception to the Federal Tort Claims Act. This exception says that the government cannot be held liable for decisions that involve the exercise of judgment or discretion at a policy-making level. The appeals court ruled that the decisions about how to manufacture, package, label, and ship ammonium nitrate were all discretionary policy decisions, the kind of high-level governmental choices that the Tort Claims Act was designed to protect from lawsuits. It did not matter that those decisions had been negligent. It did not matter that they had led to the deaths of nearly 600 people. What mattered, according to the court, was that they were decisions made by government officials in the exercise of their official duties, and that made them immune from liability. The case went to the Supreme Court on June 8, 1953, 6 years after the disaster. The Supreme Court issued its ruling. In a 4-3 decision, the court upheld the appeals court and ruled against the victims of Texas City. The majority opinion held that the government's actions, from the production specifications to the packaging standards to the shipping arrangements, were all protected under the discretionary function exception. The government could not be sued for making policy decisions, even if those decisions resulted in catastrophic harm. 3 justices dissented. They argued that the government had been clearly negligent and that the discretionary function exception was never intended to shield the government from accountability for reckless conduct that killed hundreds of civilians. But the dissent did not carry the day. The vote was 4-3. The families of Texas City, who had spent 6 years fighting for justice in the courts, received nothing. Think about that for a moment. Nearly 600 people were killed. An entire city was leveled. An entire fire department was wiped out. The government had manufactured the chemical, set the rules, ignored the warnings, and failed to enforce its own safety regulations. And when the families went to court and proved all of that, the highest court in the land said, "This is not the kind of thing you are allowed to sue the government for." But the families of Texas City refused to give up. After the Supreme Court ruling, the Texas congressional delegation took the fight out of the courts and into Congress. They introduced a private relief bill, a special act of Congress designed to compensate the victims directly since the legal system had failed them. The bill faced opposition. It took years of political pressure, lobbying, and public advocacy before it finally passed. In 1955, 8 years after the explosions, Congress approved a special compensation act that awarded a total of $16.5 million to 1,394 victims and their families. It was a fraction of the $200 million the courts had originally considered. Many of the families had already spent years in financial ruin, having lost their homes, their breadwinners, and their savings in the disaster, and then spent years more paying legal fees for a case they ultimately lost. The compensation, when it finally came, was too little and too late for many of them. The Texas City disaster changed the way the United States handles hazardous materials, but the changes came slowly, and they came at a cost that should never have been necessary. New regulations were put in place for the manufacturing, packaging, and shipping of ammonium nitrate. Cool temperature storage requirements were established. Specialized containers replaced the paper bags. Restrictions were placed on storing ammonium nitrate near reactive materials. The disaster also led to the development of mutual aid systems between cities and industrial facilities, so that when one community's emergency services were overwhelmed or destroyed, neighboring communities could respond. These are systems that are still in use today across the country. But here is the question that still hangs over this story nearly 80 years later. The Texas City disaster killed more people than any industrial accident in American history. It triggered the first class action lawsuit ever filed against the federal government. It exposed how the government had quietly stripped away safety protocols from a known explosive compound to save money and speed up peacetime shipping. And yet this event is barely a footnote in most American history books. Most Americans have never heard of it. Ask yourself why that is. It is not because it was a small event. It is not because it happened in a remote place that nobody cared about. It is because the entity responsible for what happened was the same entity that writes the history. When the government is both the defendant and the record keeper, stories have a way of getting quiet. The people of Texas City did not forget. Every year, survivors and their families gather at the Memorial Cemetery on the north side of town, where the 63 unidentified victims are buried beneath the earth. The ship's anchor, the 2-ton piece of steel that was launched nearly 2 miles through the air, sits in a memorial park as a permanent reminder of what happened on that April morning. And the names of the 27 firefighters who gave their lives are engraved on a plaque at Fire Station 2, where every new generation of Texas City firefighters begins their service by learning the story of the men who came before them. Tommy Baker never found Margaret. She was one of the 145 Monsanto workers who died in the first explosion. Her body was among those that could not be identified. Tommy stayed in Texas City for the rest of his life. He remarried eventually, but he never stopped driving past the waterfront on April 16th. Ruth Grimes, Walter's wife, spent 3 days searching the hospitals and makeshift aid stations before she found Walter alive in a hospital in Galveston with a broken arm and second-degree burns. He went back to work at Monsanto when the plant was rebuilt in 1949. Because that was what you did. You went back to work. Joe Fletcher, the volunteer firefighter, never came home. His name is on the plaque at the fire station. His helmet was never found. Nearly 600 people died because a chemical that the government knew was dangerous was treated as though it were harmless. The safety protocols existed, the knowledge existed, the regulations existed, but the will to enforce them did not, because enforcing them would have cost money and slowed down a shipping program that the government wanted to run as cheaply and as quickly as possible. The people of Texas City paid the price for that calculation with their lives. And when they asked for justice, they were told that the decisions that killed their families were protected by the law. This story matters because it is not just about 1947. It is about a pattern that repeats itself every time an industrial disaster kills people who had no idea they were at risk, from Texas City to Bhopal, to the Deepwater Horizon to the train derailment at East Palestine, Ohio. The same questions come up every single time. Who knew the danger? Who failed to act? And who will be held accountable? The answer, more often than we would like to admit, is the same answer the families of Texas City received nearly 80 years ago. And that is why this story deserves to be told. Not because it is old, but because it is not over. If this story stayed with you, I want to hear what you think. Had you ever heard of the Texas City disaster before watching this video? Drop it in the comments. And if you think more people should know about this, share this video with someone who cares about history. If you thought this was shocking, the next one might be worse. In 1944, an entire neighborhood in Cleveland, Ohio, vanished in minutes, and the cause was hiding right beneath their feet. Subscribe so you do not miss it.